Hello all, and welcome to ICC for the recap of the semi-final stage of the FIDE Grand Prix, currently going on in Belgrade, Serbia. This is the second out of 3 legs that will be played to determine what 2 players will qualify for the upcoming Candidates Tournament. And this tournament has the same format as the previous leg in Berlin. There are 4 pools consisting of 4 players each, and the winners of each of these individual pools move on to play a knockout tournament. And that is where we will pick up today with the semifinals. But first, a little bit about how we got here. The 4 pool winners for this event were MVL, or Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from France, Richard Rapport from Hungary, Giri from the Netherlands, and Giri and Andreikin from Russia. And all those names are very standard in these events. They're all top-tier players. Perhaps the one surprise we could consider to be Andreikin. He sort of benefited from Grishuk's poor form. They were in the same pool together, and Grishuk did not have his best tournament, and Andreikin won a really wild game in the last round in order to qualify. But in general, all of these 4 players are very elite players, very well known, so it's no surprise to see them make it to the knockout stage. And the pairings for the knockout in the semifinals was MVL versus Rapport and Giri versus Andreikin. And again, it's the same format as the previous tournament in Berlin. The players play 2 classical games, and if those games are tied at 1-1, then they move on to rapid games to break the tie, and then if that's still not enough, they move on to blitz, and finally, if they have to, they would go to Armageddon. So let's jump right in here. I'm going to start with the match between MVL and Rapport, and in the first game, Rapport had the white pieces, and he chose to open with 1d4, and the thing with MVL is he loves to play the Grunfeld, so Rapport certainly was not surprised by this. And they went straight into kind of an old line, this bishop to c4, but there are some modern twists to it. The idea of the Grunfeld is to attack at the center with c5. You allow white to build up a big center and try to break it down. So knight e2. You want the knight on e2 here, not knight on f3, because you can meet bishop g4 with f3 always to break the pin. And if white were to castle here, you can see he played rook c1, but if he had castled instead, that would transpose into this big main line. There's a lot of theory in it. And the idea of rook c1 is to delay castling a little bit, and that can only mean one thing. It means that white wants to play h4, h5, and try to basically destroy black if he can. Obviously, black has counterplay against that. So the idea here for black, and what Maxime does, is he immediately opens up the center to try to get counterplay. If if black was to play some lazy move like b6, then h4, it becomes very dangerous very fast for black, and he has to deal with an attack coming quite quickly. So black has to be alert. He takes on d4, and the idea is there's a drawback of playing rook c1 for white, and that is that the king is still on e1, and we can throw in this queen a5 check, forcing white to make sort of an uncomfortable choice. A lot of people have played king f1 here before, and that's very reasonable, but of course white has lost his castling right, and then white would continue with h4 and probably try to attack. But many games have shown that black is fine there. So Rapport plays sort of a new idea. It's been played before, but not very often, and this is the move rook c3. It's a little bit clumsy looking, I must say, to pin your own rook to the king like this, but black doesn't have an immediate way to really take full advantage of it. And white also maintains, if he wants to, the right to castle. He is not committed to playing king f1, so at any moment, if he feels he needs to, he can always castle. And that's the idea of this move. And I think that black can equalize here, but MVL, I guess, did not know or did not remember it very well. And he played the move e5. Whereas I think that the move rook d8, queen d2, and by the way, black can also start with bishop g4 and put the a rook on d8. But the idea is, actually I will show that just to illustrate. So bishop to g4, f3, and black can play rook a d8 here. The point is this bishop on g4 is not advisable to be captured, because after knight takes d4, white is dealing with a lot of pins and a lot of tactics, and he'll lose some material there because his king is still not safe. He just doesn't have time to consolidate. So white can play queen d2, and then even going back with the bishop to e6 is very reasonable for black here, because basically the doubled e-pawns will not be a problem for black. You can even use them later to undermine with pawn to e5. But after e5 immediately, which is a logical move, the point is after d5 he jumps in with knight d4. It's positionally risky for black in that you're gifting white a protected pass pawn here on d5, and very often in the Grunfeld that's fine for black. The pawn is not dangerous if it can be contained. However, it's always a bit strategically risky, because in a lot of endgames you can see that white will be able to advance the pawn further and further. The deeper you go into the endgame, the more dangerous this pawn can become. So let's see what comes of that. Rapport plays bishop d2, breaking the pin. Obviously he could not castle immediately because black would take on e2, and then the rook on c3 would be hanging. So bishop to d7, just developing, preparing to put a rook on the c-file. Knight takes d4, e takes d4, and rook c1. And now, note that black has a passed pawn on d4 as well, but it's not protected. So, whereas white's pawn on d5 is very secure, black's pawn on d4 could potentially become a weakness very quickly. And also, black's Grunfeld bishop on g7, kind of the key piece of the opening, is a little restricted by this pawn on d4. Sure, it defends the pawn on b4 very well, but it also is lacking some activity because of it. So after queen a3 by MVL, Rapport goes straight into the endgame. He trades queens. Black is forced to trade queens here. And again, we can see that he's maintaining these pawns on e4 and d5. And due to this, it is extremely bad for black already. And that's a little surprising maybe, because he hasn't made any clear mistakes. But this whole plan of e5 and putting his knight on d4 and getting this structure is just not really justified here, because he has a couple of choices. He can either just kind of continue playing normally, like put a rook on c8 for example. He can play this way, and if white castles, it's a natural move. Then black doesn't really have an easy way to follow up here. He can't really get his queenside pawns going at all, like his b and a pawns, because he would love to play like a5, a4 or something like this, but the bishop on d2 controls a5. And let's say he tries to bring his bishop into the game. This is just a move that might come across as natural. Well, then that's just running into more f4, e5, and white is going to advance his pawns even further. And yeah, it's really all about this d5 pawn versus this d4 pawn. And white's d5 pawn is protected, and in general, it's really, really hard to play for black here. So honestly, that was probably still the better choice for black, just to kind of continue playing normally and hoping to hold on, but it's a long suffering affair, and instead MVL decided he wanted to do something immediate. Before white has the chance to castle and stabilize, he immediately strikes with rook a8, putting pressure on the e-pawn, and after f3 he plays f5. But this opens up the long diagonal, well, not the long diagonal, but a long diagonal of this bishop on b3 is sitting on against white's king. And white immediately invades, rook c7, bishop b5, a4, kicking the bishop again, So the bishop is on d3, and it looks like black is getting some play. And it's true, he's attacking the e4 pawn very nicely. But the problem is white has a bit of a higher priority threat here, and that's this d pawn just advancing down the board. And this is coming with check, by the way, so you have to move the king. d7 going further. Rook b8. If rook d8, then bishop to b4 also, just like in the game. So bishop to b4, and the idea is this bishop is coming to e7. So yeah, it's a very surprising situation in which all of white's moves are natural and very good, and black is just completely helpless against them. So he plays bishop to e5. Again, if he moved rook fd8, then bishop to e7 would be curtains. So here they trade the rooks, but we see there's a threat of mate here with bishop to f6. So black has no time to do anything like take on e4 or something. So king g7 and e5. So this whole sequence has obviously turned out very well for white because he maintains his pawn on d7, and also he's resolved the problem of the pawn tension of e5, of e4 and f5, and he advances his pawn to e5. So now he has two connected passed pawns. So if it wasn't hopeless before for black, it's really quite bad now. b5, there's no other move to recommend. You've got to try something. Bishop f6 check. King goes back. e6 threatening e7, which is checkmate with the pawn. That's pretty funny. Bishop to d8, and now you don't want to trade on d8 and let black get this sort of blockade on the dark squares. Instead, he plays bishop to e5. Rook b6. He takes on d4 with another tempo. He wants to play bishop c5 check if he can. So rook c6. A takes b5. Bishop takes b5. And just king f2. At this point, white is even up a pawn, but the most relevant factor is still his pawns on d7 and e6. It's not very often you can survive an opponent's pawns advanced so far into your camp. So king e7, bishop to e3. He wants to come around the other way to g5. So finally the bishops are traded, which is maybe a minor victory for black, but Rapport has already calculated that this is completely over because he can get rook d1 here. And he's simply threatening to play d8 queen, and if black plays king to d8, then e7 check. So rook c3, king f4, and at this moment MVL resigned. Just to sort of illustrate why he did that, there's not really a good way to stop d8 queen, and if rook to d3, sure, he gets to trade off the rooks, but then king e5 comes, and there's many ways to win. This is just an example, but white can even just play d8 queen and king f6, and he's going to play e7 next, bishop to f7, and that pawn is going to cost black his b5 bishop, and then white will be up a piece and will win very easily. So that looked like an example of good preparation, and once MVL didn't respond correctly, it was basically natural moves the whole way through. So he made Rapport, that is, made that game look quite easy. So on to the next one, where MVL is now white and he has to win. So he obviously came looking for a fight. He played e4, e5. We get a Roy Lopez, and Rapport with a slight surprise. He plays the delayed Steinitz with d6. It's called the delayed Steinitz because he included a6 before playing d6, and the idea of that is he now has the option of b5 in many cases. Maxime castles, and now a typical way to play this position would be to play bishop to d7 and then g6 and bishop g7 and fianchetto, and sort of play it slowly. But instead he plays this rather old move of bishop to g4. It's not very common anymore because it's quite risky. So it's really funny that in a game where he only needs to draw, Rapport decides to play a very combative line. And after h3, you can drop back bishop to h5, but then the bishop would be misplaced here. So in order to justify bishop g4, Rapport plays h5. Now this line is very concrete, and it's not completely sound for black. It's not terrible though. It's not like it loses by force. White does get an advantage with extremely precise play, but Rapport figured that either his opponent would not know it or would not be able to find his way through the complications. So again, very interesting psychological choice in a game where you only need a draw, but let's see how it turns out for him. So after knight takes d4, here white can and should and does take the piece because he doesn't want to allow queen h4. He can't play knight takes d4, queen h4, so he plays knight g5. And yeah, white is up a piece, that's true. But this knight on g5 is a bit stranded and perhaps can be trapped and picked off if black plays his cards right. So he starts with knight h6, just defending the f7 pawn. And g3, the idea is a lot of times he can play king g2 and maybe bring a rook to the h-file. He's ensuring that white will never get mated here. And also white might play f4 later to reinforce his knight. So bishop to e7, and we see this f4. So this knight on g5 is secure for now, but it has no way back. We see this pawn on g4 for black guards the h3 and f3 squares, so there's no way back. Queen d7, and f5 is apparently an inaccurate move, but it's very difficult to understand why. I think it just takes away protection of the g5 knight, and black will be able to use some clever maneuvers to win it back. And it's not obvious what that move is, but in a few moves I'll show you. So he starts with c6 just to guard the d5 square. It's very useful in a lot of lines. And after knight c3, he plays queen d8. And here MVL decides to just sacrifice the piece back. He plays knight takes f7. But the real point of black's play is if queen d2, it looks like you're just defending the knight. Black has this move that I alluded to a few moments ago in this knight g8. Very pretty. And the point is you just put your rook on h5 and you can't save the knight. And that's a really nice idea, and I wonder maybe if MVL missed it from a distance, but in any case he decided correctly that he has nothing better than at least getting some pawns in return. So he takes on f7 and he takes on g4. And how do we evaluate this? It's objectively close to equal. Material is equal, and both kings are not entirely secure, but not entirely exposed either. White's knight on c3 is really the worst piece. It's not doing a lot. So that's why he brings his knight to d1, because you see here the d5 square is guarded, so there's no real use of the knight on c3. He remaneuvers it. The dark square bishops are traded. The queens are traded. And again, Rapport only needs a draw, so it's fine just to hold the line here. Knight g5, attacking the e4 pawn. It's defended. And king e7 was not played. Castle queenside was played. But king e7 is perhaps an improvement, just keeping the king flexible. Because the point is, after castle queenside, now the a and c pawns are a little more exposed, I feel. And MVL immediately plays c4 to take advantage of that. But perhaps the king on e7 could be better placed in order to keep it easier for black to defend his pawns. So king to c7, rook to h1, bc4, bc4, a5, just trying to keep all of his pawns protected. But here he should trade a pair of rooks probably, where the rook takes h1, because king b6 turns out to be a quite large mistake, because white now has two rooks to harass the black pawns. And after rook h7, MVL brings his rooks in, and he's going to win this a pawn. Black has counterplay on the h-file, but he has no real follow-up here. It looks scary, but black has no way to bring his rook on h8 into the game. So knight f3, c5 check is a very nice move to deprive the black king of the c5 square. And it's very close to winning for white. It objectively is winning, but it's not so easy. He repeats a few times. Now he plays rook a3, attacking the knight on f3. Knight to d2 check. King to g1. Again, there's just no follow-up for black. Knight to c4. rook d3, and this king on b4 is just really quite caught out, and he has a lot of pawn weaknesses. All of black's pawns are quite vulnerable here. Rook a7, attacking the g-pawn. Rook b8, he doesn't really care. b3, knight a5, knight g4, knight takes b3, and this is apparently the moment where MVL gave away his last chance to potentially win the game. He should take on h6 here, and then after c4, he comes and takes this pawn. It's not entirely obvious, I would say, from a human perspective, that this is so easy, because black can put a knight on d4, he has a very intimidating c-pawn, but with correct play, white should win. So it's understandable that he didn't do this. He thought, why should I waste my knight on g4 for this rook that is not doing anything? But the problem here, as we'll see, is black, he keeps his rook, but also black has two c-pawns here. So even though white maybe has gained a little bit of time, black keeps his rook and also has two c-pawns instead of one, as he would have in the other line. And that makes it a lot harder for white to play. So he plays rook g6, but he plays c5 just to keep the pawn. He wins the rook for the knight anyway, but now this pawn is coming down the board, and it's going to cost white a rook. He gives up a rook. White has two pawns of its own. It's a completely wild position, but it's objectively a draw with correct play here. He brings his knight back to stop these pawns. Knight b5, attacking the rook. And now Rapport calculates to the end. He can just ignore white's pawns because he has a pawn of his own. They both queen. If white could make another queen, he would win, but black has the move here, and he can perpetually check white's king. Absolutely wild game. They agreed to a draw here because queen c6, and it's a perpetual. So, yeah, I don't really know what to say about that game. Rapport played an insane opening choice under the circumstances. He got out of the opening fine, then he was in trouble later, then this crazy endgame where no human could play properly. I don't know. Just incredible match overall, and Rapport moves on to the finals, so congrats to him. Now we are on to the next match between Giri and Andreikin. This is the first game. Giri is white in this first game. He plays a little bit of an offbeat opening, b3, in the Sicilian, but there's some poison to it, and we'll see this game gets very sharp fast. He plays queen e2, immediately challenging this bishop on e4. He retreats, and now h4. This is sort of a common idea in these types of structures. It's not really a French structure, but say this pawn on e6 and pawn on e5. The point is white is gaining space. He can play h5, and also he can lift his rook h3 to g3 or something like that. So knight to c6, just developing h5. Knight to b4, taking advantage of the fact that if white castles, then the a2 pawn is hanging. So d3 is played, which is a bit of a concession because now this bishop on f1 is stuck behind this pawn. b5, just expanding some more. a3, knight drops back, and queen to d2. After rook to c8, it's like black is kind of waiting for white to castle here. And Giri is also playing these useful moves, queen d2, rook h3, not committing his king yet. And black is also not worried about his king at the moment. Queen c7, and now white decides it's the right time to castle. And knight a5 is a very curious move. It's possible he could have played a variety of other things, like knight d4 is interesting, a5, a4 is possible. But knight a5 is a little bit strange, but we'll see his idea in a few moves. So knight to g5, creating some kingside play. Bishop to e7, rook g3. It looks to me, just from a human perspective, that white is getting there first. It looks like his attack is coming just a bit quicker than black's. So c4, this is sort of what was alluded to with the move knight to a5. Black is immediately breaking because I guess he has to, right? He has to do something at some point. He can't let white have a free hand. And Giri wisely is not going to open the position here. He plays b4 to close it. And after h6, this is a very interesting moment because it's one of those cases where you start calculating a forcing move, like knight takes f7, which is what Giri played. But after the simple knight h3, it's hard for me to understand what exactly he didn't like about this. I think it's just one of those things where you start calculating knight takes f7 and you focus on it. But if you took a step back and kind of zoomed out a bit, here we see that you're not sacrificing anything for white. This knight on a5 is still under attack, and rook takes g7 is coming. And also, if the knight moves back, bishop takes c4, probably even a better move. So, just a sample line, knight c6, you take the pawn, and if black tries this, then white just comes down here and takes on b7, and the check on a1 is harmless, because king d2. Maybe from afar, that's easy to miss. But white is just up a piece here and is winning. So, yeah, after knight h3, it's literally resignable. There's just no move. All of black's speculative attacking ideas here just don't work objectively. So it's just over. So I don't know. It's a surprising miss, but it's understandable if you can consider that he spent all his time on knight takes f7 and forgot to take a step back. So anyway, he gives up the knight, and now he takes on a5. Bishop d5 is a nice move to secure the sort of the pawn structure on d7 and e6. Queen f4, king g8, rook takes d5. Very tempting move because you cannot take it because of this really nice idea. You open up the bishop and queen f7 mate is coming. But there's this move. Andreikin saw this. He did not blunder rook takes d5, and now he blocks the g file with tempo. Also, by the way, white's queen is pinned, so he can't move it. He has to take. And now he wins 2 rooks for 2 bishops. Very strange material imbalance. If you go by pure numerical value, the rooks are better. They're worth more. But it depends on the position. The bishop pair is often very strong, as it is here. And black's king is not comfortable at all. His rook on h8 is not very good. Black's rooks don't have files to work with very easily, so it's maybe a slight advantage for black here, but nothing more. It's very close to dynamic equality, I would say. So queen takes d5, king f8. The most important factor here by far is king safety. If black can keep his king safe, he has no reason to be unhappy here. Bishop to d4, just bringing the bishop towards the center, and queen c6. Andreikin sees that he can force the queen trade immediately, so he does not hesitate for one moment, even though he's still giving his a7 pawn. It's a lot more important to get the queens off the board. So Giri defends his h5 pawn, a6, just protecting that pawn, which was temporarily hanging, king d2, and it's a very interesting situation in which this a6 pawn can be won by white, possibly, no guarantee, but he can play bishop f3, bishop to b7, for example, and then this a pawn is going to be a problem, but it also takes time for white to do that, and black should be able to organize his rooks in the meantime to prepare. So king e7, king c3, rook b8, a4, rook b1. Black is playing very logically. He wants to activate his rook. Bishop to f3, and now they agree to a draw. It's a little disappointing because you like to see games be played out to their logical conclusion, but here the position is sort of objectively around equal, and maybe both players didn't really know what was going on. They were nervous. They thought a draw was okay. I'll just give a sample line here of something that could have happened. Bishop f3, rook c8, bishop b6, rook a1. Basically, white is coming around to take this pawn, but as in a lot of variations, we're going to see black give back one of the rooks. Very common idea here, just to get rid of the bishop pair, and then we get this endgame. Material is numerically equal. Maybe black can try to play for a win with his active rook, try to pick off some of white's pawns, but with correct play, it should be a draw. So that means we're going to tie breaks. That's always thrilling. In the first game, Andreikin was white, and I am not going to show you the whole game because it is very short. I'm just going to show you the end because of something interesting that happened here. So as I said, this is Andreikin as white, and here, if I go here, Giri played knight f8, knight d4, and knight g6, knight d6. this is how the game ended. They repeated. Now black is better here, and at this moment he can try a variety of moves. He can play queen g4, bishop c5. The white d5 pawn is overextended. White's not really developed. His king is slightly uncomfortable on the dark squares. So Giri had every reason to play on here. But in a mini match, I guess he thought he's black in game one. Wow, I just realized that I skipped out on something. Sorry about that. I just jumped right to the tie breaks. As a matter of fact, game two was drawn. The classical game two was drawn, and I'm not going to show it because it was very boring. Sorry about that. I just jumped straight ahead there. But yeah, this is game one of the tie breaks, and this is where Giri decided to make a draw as black because he wanted to have the white pieces next and a chance to win the match. But very often that can come back to bite you. A little bit of foreshadowing here, because in this final game of the match, I sort of spoiled it, but Giri was white here. He opened with 1e4, and Andreikin plays this interesting variation of the Taimanov Sicilian, in which he plays an early a6, and white decides to take on c6 because in this structure the pawn on a6 doesn't really benefit black as much as, say, a queen on c7 would. So bishop to d3, both players just develop, knight f6, queen f3, potentially highlighting the idea of queen to g3 to cause some uncomfortableness on black's king side. Bishop to b7, rook e1, black is just kind of keeping his king in the center, and h5. White maybe can consider taking on g7, but rook g8, he's maybe scared of some attack on the open g file. So both players just developing. It's the kind of position where white is pretty much always better, but it's not easy to play. It's not easy to find a clear plan sometimes for either side. You're just kind of maneuvering your pieces around. You're waiting around for a good moment to strike. And that's what happens for a while. They trade dark squared bishops. And it looks nice for white. His king is better. His pieces are generally better. Black does have a solid central pawn structure. That's the main asset here. That's why black likes to play this way. But if white can open things up, if he can get at the king, it can become very bad. It can spiral out of control for black. So you've got to be quite careful. And we see that white is kind of getting there. He's opening the queen side, and once he has an open b file to work with, it's just a matter of time before he makes inroads. And that looked like it was going to be the story of this game for a very long time. Giri is playing very well. Queen f3, rook b7 is coming. Rook b8 to try to trade a pair of rooks because black's other rook on h8 is doing nothing whatsoever. And this was the moment where white can basically win with knight b5. To bring the knight to d6, there's a couple of lines here, but one example of a natural way for black to play, say queen c5, knight d6, knight f5, there's rook takes f8, and rook b7. This wins the game because you can't protect f7 very conveniently. If you take on d6, then e takes, and then queen will mate on f7. Or if you play rook h7 here, then now's a good moment to play rook b8, king g7, knight e8, and you're beginning to make the black king miserable. So this would be very strong, knight b5 to d6. Instead he traded, allowed the queen to come back, and knight c6. I guess he was tempted because rook b8 is a key idea, but after the calm move queen to c5, and knight f5, just everything is protected. And Giri completely collapsed here. He should trade on f5 and play that position. Instead, he took on g6 with the idea king takes g6, queen g4 check, and then he can consider taking on f7 or continue checking the king. But queen c6 was played, and if he had played rook a7 here, then probably the best way for black to play is actually to repeat once, because there's a lot of orders in which black can do this, but the point is he keeps attacking the rook, queen b8, queen e8, now f7 is defended. So he can simply take on g6, and he's completely secure and completely winning. So I guess Giri realized that, and he decided back at this moment to just give the rook away. And the problem with this endgame for white is that even though the queen and knight often work together against an exposed king, white's knight is on h8. So he cannot give a check to black's king here without losing his knight. So he has no next move, so Andreikin just goes and takes all the pawns because white still can't do anything. He can't play queen h8 because of king takes f7. So he had to spend all this time bringing his knight back around. And now Andreikin takes more pawns. He takes e5, he comes back, and now he finds a nice way, a very easy way to end the game, forcing a queen trade with this very pretty move. And then knight takes h5, and then we get into this endgame where white is completely lost because he's down a pawn. Black has two passed pawns that are running down the board, and white's pawns on g2 and h3 are completely contained by black's pawn on h4. There's no way for white to create a passed pawn at all. He has no counterplay, and black wins easily. I'll just show the remaining moves, but it is not at all difficult for a grandmaster to convert this. And yeah, this knight on a4 can't contain both of black's pawns, whereas black can contain white's only pawn with his knight. And yeah, d3 and Giri resigned here because knight takes f8, d1 queen, and white will easily, or black rather, will easily bring his queen back to pick off the final pawn for white. So yeah, maybe a little bit of a surprise that Andreikin won this match. He was perhaps an underdog, but he played well at the critical moments, and although Giri had very promising positions both in this game and also in the first classical game and in the first tiebreak game where I showed you that he repeated, he just was not able to make anything happen. At the critical moments, I guess Andreikin had stronger nerves and he calculated better. So we are going to see a final between Rapport and Andreikin, and that is going to be very exciting. Particularly, it's important for Rapport because he did well in the first leg, in the first Berlin leg. So if he wins this tournament, then he is almost guaranteed to make it to the candidates. But let's see what happens. There's a lot on the line. I'll be back to recap the finals for you. And until then, I will see you next time.